from DBS Asia Central. It's the 27th of February 2020. This is Kopi Time, a podcast series on economies and global markets. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist, your host for the next 30 minutes. We are presently inundated with the COVID-19 outbreak and issues around that, and we'll be covering our latest forecast and analysis on the fallout in considerable detail during our Macro Insights livestream on the 2nd of March. And we have been doing it in the past, we'll do it in the future, but today's podcast is not about that. We will try to take a break from such blanket coverage of the Wuhan virus epidemic/pandemic. Instead, we are aiming today for something refreshingly different. To do that, our guest today is Slava Shilin, whose day job is to analyze credit markets in the region, but that is not what we have him here today. Slava is here because he has a very interesting background, which lends to rather interesting insights. He is of Russian origin, has UK nationality, has been based in Singapore for nearly a decade, and most interestingly, he is almost fluent in Mandarin. He has also traveled extensively through China for business and pleasure. Slava, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Taimur. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. First off, I guess we have to ask you the obvious. What got you so interested in China that you had to learn the language, which is a really hard one? And tell us how hard actually was it to pick up Mandarin?
To start answering this question, I think I just have to probably say why I moved to Singapore to begin with. My family, including my wife and my children, are big fans of Asian culture, Asian lifestyle, including the weather, of course. Been based in the UK for 10 years before that. Gets you longing for sunshine quite a lot. We moved to Asia to get exposure to all of that. Life and ancestral sort of background. It's impossible sort of not to be exposed to Chinese language and Chinese lifestyle living in Singapore, which was a great revelation to us. It took me real quick to realize that living in Asia and building your career, building your life here is impossible without having a direct exposure to Chinese language and culture. And I am a big fan of foreign languages. I learned quite a few in the past, including Italian, French, of course, English. Then I decided that I want to try Chinese. And very quickly after I started my journey into Chinese language, I realized that it's a long-term journey and I am completely in love with it. I really feel that Chinese language is coming somewhere from the heart. When people speak, they are not simply saying words using their vocal cords. They're really using their soul and their hearts and the way they pronounce the sounds, the way they put the sentence structures. It's really passionate, really emotional, and really deep. And this is my biggest commitment in life, apart from being married to my wife for almost 19 years now. And I thoroughly enjoy it. I just wanted to maybe say here is that I know a lot of people, a lot of foreigners who begin their journey into Chinese language and culture and they stop at just picking up the speaking part of it. But I thoroughly enjoy the whole range of the language, including reading and writing, and I thoroughly recommend to anyone who decides to embark on this journey, please go all the way. Do not stop just at the speaking part because you're missing out massively on understanding the lifestyle, the intricacies of thinking, of culture, of how China ticks, basically. That's why I don't even have to push myself every day to learn it further. I just keep going. So as Chinese say, 加油. That's probably the answer to this question.
But it is very different from any other language you've learned in your life.
It is definitely different in technical terms and also in terms of the grammar, etc., because it's pictographic. It's impossible to guess how, it is when you reach a certain level to guess how the certain character is pronounced. But unlike any other alphabet-based language, you cannot remember how to pronounce this unless you actually memorize. That's why without practice, without doing your homework, this language is probably the easiest to forget. That's what makes it difficult. And also, probably the more advanced level you achieve, I guess you can say, the more lost you get, because this language is extremely moody. And you can use 5 different ways of saying I'm sorry, 10 ways of giving affirmative answers, and things like that. So you just probably need to make your picks and carry on.
So it's been 6 years since you picked up the language, and you have attained some fairly advanced degree of proficiency, although you stressed that I don't say you're fluent in the language. That was very humble of you.
Almost fluent, yes.
But Slava, so are you basically then saying that Singapore has a fairly well-established infrastructure for expats to learn Mandarin?
Definitely. I would say even we are in Asia, you can definitely learn literally any mainstream language of the world, be it Spanish, be it Japanese, be it Arabic. So I actually know friends who do it. So that's why I'm quite confident in making this statement.
Now, when you say that it is equally important to learn how to read and write the language as opposed to just learning it, speaking the language, are you saying that from a professional angle that, to understand company balance sheets is useful, or this is very much of a personal perspective?
It is coming from the angle of the fact that Chinese language has a lot of philosophy behind it. And to understand the philosophy of Chinese culture, you actually need to read the characters to be able to read them, because the way the characters are constructed can tell you a lot of wise stories, funny stories, the ones that you probably will never pick up in any other alphabet-based language. I know it's pretty basic, but just to give you an example, when you write a character, you have a character. It consists of different radicals. So you take a left side, you put the radical depicting a woman. Then you take a radical depicting a man. Together, when you put it together, it means good.
Interesting.
So ni hao, the famous ni hao, is the part hao, is the woman and the man together, which means good. Or another example, you take the sun and the moon, you put them together, and it means bright. So what can be the brightest as sun and moon put together? So this is how these are very basic examples, but the more you learn the language, the more of these examples you go through, you start to think what is sort of the philosophy behind it, what were the fathers of the nation thousands of years ago thinking about the language, especially that this language has probably it's one of the rare examples where, China being probably is one of the, or maybe the only ancient civilization, which is equally ancient as the Egyptian, which is still here.
Right.
And the language went through the same evolution, meaning it started as really the ancient pictographic Chinese, where you can say it was designed to be written on the stone, on piece of wood. And the characters have been evolving quite a few times, and the ones that we see now are probably more of the technical reflection of the original meaning. But if you know this, you can really relate to what is behind the language, which is really important. So it's not about the grammar or understanding the financial statements, but really actually also trying to get the message between the lines, so to say.
But I want to stay on that subject a little longer, which is that, let's say there are a lot of publicly listed Chinese companies. Many of them are listed in the U.S. stock market. When they raise bond issuances, they issue prospectus. And a lot of this stuff is in English. But are we still at the point where knowing Mandarin and being able to read a lot of those documents in their original form or going to the websites in the Mandarin version still gives somebody an edge? Or have we reached the point where it's not that important anymore?
China it's a very interesting point, Taimur, but I can say that China is perhaps one of the few countries in the world where knowing the language still gives you a competitive edge. Even if you're dealing with the Chinese banks that are the biggest banks on the planet, you'd be surprised that speaking English is it's secondary. You definitely have time advantage. You definitely have the decision-making advantage, the access to information, the depth of the information, if you can read Mandarin.
What about the fact that some people say that, well, even if you do speak the language, you're a foreigner, and you will never be able to disarm cynical Chinese? Give us some personal examples where you've actually managed to bring down barriers and it has helped you actually. It doesn't have to be professional, it could be personal, it could be just a day-to-day occurrence where surprising somebody with your knowledge of Mandarin has been helpful.
I have to say this is one of the fascinating facts. Even being in Singapore and just randomly dropping something like, "zhen de bao qian," like "I'm really sorry," in a conversation with the local Singaporean Chinese person brings out an excitement and a smile and a lot of associated positive emotions, because people do not expect a Caucasian person, for example, speak Chinese language at all. And that is definitely present in China as well, where people just simply do not expect you to know the language. And that's why, when you have no expectations, exceeding those expectations is very easy. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to surprise local Chinese with your knowledge of the language. But as in many cases, the trick is if you say something, there is always a risk that they will respond back. and it's sort of like a rolling snowball that they get excited, they start speaking faster, and then you run into this difficulty where you have to then say, okay.
Slow down.
Yeah, slow down. But I face the situation almost daily.
Okay, so that takes us to your travel experiences. You've been to China quite a few times in recent years, haven't you?
Indeed.
And what takes you to China? Is it work-related or also personal interest that takes you to China?
I think it's a similar case with many other countries which I visited in my life, that my first visit is always through work. There's a business trip or some conference that I have to attend, and then the more I go, the more I get interested on a personal level. I want to take my family there. I want to explore more. I love going off the beaten track, as people say. And that's why all the subsequent visits to China were more of the personal nature.
And you've been to off the beaten track as in tier 2, tier 3 cities?
Indeed, and also climbing mountains, going along the rivers, and staying in, as you say, in not sort of mainstream cities, but definitely trying to gain as much experience as possible on what is it that the real life is all about in China.
So let's start with your latest trip to China. Didn't you spend a large part of last summer in China?
Indeed, it was my dream to go to China for a few weeks on a so-called language and culture immersion course, where you stay either with a family or somewhere not in the hotel, basically. And you learn Mandarin intensively, maybe 5 or 6 hours a day, depending on what type of the language you want to pick up, whether this is general or business. And you also have a lot of extracurricular activities that, you can ask some travel agents to choose for you. But what I preferred is to give myself a lot of interesting daily tasks in going out of the box, sort of leaving my comfort zone and trying to explore the country, throw myself into real-life situations where I have to deal with everything myself, dealing with different accents and trying to solve problems that I create for myself. So that's what was exciting last summer when I went to Nanjing, which is the capital of Jiangsu province, and also spent some time in Anhui, so those two provinces the most, and got the on-the-ground feeling of how it is to mix amongst the locals.
So what kind of specific tasks were you setting yourself up for your day-to-day adventures?
I just wanted to, at this point, also say, in order to answer your question, that I specifically decided a couple of years ago to switch from learning general Chinese and go into the business Chinese. Because I find that although it's called business Chinese, all the topics, all the grammar that you learn, is actually about your real life daily situations.
Paying bills, opening account.
Bills, arranging meetings, printing documents, and traveling.
Buying tickets.
Exactly. Anything that you actually face every day, I would say, in any situation, whether it's your family, whether it's your work, whether it's your friends, as opposed to learning about paintings in the museum or the history of all the dynasties in China, which is the general Chinese dedicates a lot of time to that. Of course, I like learning about those things, but I think the bulk of my time I decided to dedicate to advancing my business Chinese, where I can actually eventually host the meetings in the language and read documents in Mandarin as well. So in order to make my life less comfortable and more exciting in China, I was creating different tasks for myself on a daily basis, starting from something as simple as going to a post office to buy stamps. Sounds easy, but not done as easy as it sounds. All the way to trying to open a local bank account. Which was an extremely refreshing experience, where I realized that despite of all this hype about Chinese banks being the biggest on the planet, when it comes to simple tasks like that, we realize that there is still a lot of old-fashioned paperwork is involved.
So you filled out quite a few forms.
Quite a few forms, faced different requirements, and tried to explain myself why is it that I actually want this account. And trying different types of accounts. So it was, fascinating experience, especially as I work in the financial sector. It was really relating to me, sort of in my daily work. And, of course, traveling, trying to sort the problems of missing utensils in the room and trying to kind of describe what is it that I want. So yes, something that you would probably say is quite easy to do when you speak your native language, but when you speak a foreign language, especially, which has a lot of different ways of expressing the same thing, it's not always easy to do.
Right. So now look, I've traveled to the bigger cities of China, to Beijing and Shanghai, and they're ultra impressive, fantastic infrastructure, very high tech. Is it that high tech in the smaller towns? When you try to, say, book a ticket, is it just a simple QR code-driven, app-driven process, or has not technology percolated through the smaller cities as much yet?
Taimur, this is probably one of the stereotypes that I sort of broke for myself when I went to China and spent time in the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 cities, that what we see in Shanghai or Beijing, you can actually see in many small towns as well. Anywhere from buying a ticket buying a train ticket or buying a SIM card, all the way to having extremely high tech and amazingly beautiful from the point of view of architecture and design, airports and buildings and railway stations and restaurants and coffee shops, and the whole infrastructure of the towns as well. And what fascinated me the most is that, for example, if you travel by bullet train, by the way, bullet trains, I had an impression, go to every single village in China. You can really see that even in the middle of the country, which is 500 or 1,000 kilometers away from Beijing or Shanghai, you travel at the speed of almost 400 kilometers an hour. You have 3 or 4 high-speed tracks running alongside with each other on the elevated high-speed railway for hundreds of miles. But not a single square meter of land is wasted underneath. It's full of fields, agricultural facilities, warehouses, water reservoirs. Every single piece of land is utilized.
It is extraordinary you're saying that, because I had a very similar experience from 35,000 feet a few years ago. So not your ground level view, but I flew on a day flight from Shanghai to Beijing. It was a clear day, 3.5-hour flight, so several thousand miles of vista down below me. And exactly the words that you just used were going through my head, that I don't see any wastage of land, but I also don't see irresponsibly developed, unplanned, or smoke-belching towns. I see greenery, I see paddy fields and reservoirs, unbelievably intricate infrastructure connecting towns to other towns, from rail to roads. And that's where I came to the conclusion that the development is not skin deep, it's very deep. And you saw it at the ground level.
It's definitely deep-rooted in the mindset of people. And this is why when I traveled to China, to its sort of inner provinces, and I saw all of this, and I saw how caring people are, how understanding, how respectful they are towards each other, towards their, earth, and towards even all the visitors, to their businesses, to their families. I realized that China has outpaced the rest of the world in its development and desire to be good decades ahead.
Right. Now, when you go to, again, the big cities of China, of course, there are entrepreneurs and, tech billionaires, and people are doing interesting things. In the smaller towns, are people still basically looking for a government job, or have they also moved on and they want to be entrepreneurs themselves and they want to create interesting things? How do you see that shift?
I would say that China has definitely made a big progress in developing private sector businesses and infrastructure for those businesses to be successful. There are, of course, places where you can still see, I think they have this special open door recruitment days where you can observe a crowd of 500 people queuing into the government building to apply for the jobs that they have. But in my view, in Chinese government, it's not even about Chinese government, but that I would say China definitely provides the infrastructure and the legislation for the development of private sector. That is definitely seen in the smaller towns as well, because I was personally left under the impression that anything you want to do in China, whether it's order a pizza or to produce 20,000 leaflets of a certain marketing material, will definitely be done almost instantly.
Same day service.
And you will have at least 20 companies competing for the same thing, and very transparent, very open, very fast. Of course, all focused on cost and the pricing, but it's amazing how fast things can be done, and it's all done by your friends living around the corner.
Right.
Yes.
Now, when I, again, coming from my big city angle, walk through the streets of Shanghai, I see Starbucks and Tesla and Domino's and Pizza Hut and McDonald's, American brands everywhere. Are the smaller town Chinese as enthusiastic a consumer of Western brands and products?
They are. So I was a witness of a Ferrari store in a Tier 3 city, and I saw a pink painted Ferrari driving out, which means that there is demand, and the foreign companies did indeed penetrate into the less affluent, or maybe it's actually not so less affluent as it seems, regions of China. But of course, local brands dominate the deeper you go into the country.
How are the local brands?
I can probably say that I can't say sort of I've driven, let's say, I think there is a brand called Haval of the car. I never drove it, so I cannot say or cannot give you my opinion, but anything to do with food is amazing. So that's my opinion.
And I can imagine the same would be for clothing, given that they are the number one exporters.
And I think it's actually a big misconception that if it's made in China, it's supposed to be cheap. There are local brands, and you can go to a local shopping mall, and you would be surprised how expensive even the local brands are.
But still desirable, therefore the brand value is substantial.
Yes, yes.
This is interesting because this is something that is very close to our heart. We've been sort of doing a lot of research on the importance of brands in pushing a country forward, that in a knowledge-based, service-based economy, which is the world we're heading toward, the importance of establishing high-quality local brands is important. So I was curious, that's why, to hear from you that even in a smaller place of China, that there is desirability of local brands and there's high quality and high value. Now, I began this podcast by saying that we're not going to talk about COVID-19 whatsoever, and we're really not. But I do want to hear from you in case, you were there for a bunch of weeks, you got sick, or you had to go to the hospital, or if you didn't, did you have any interaction with the Chinese healthcare system?
Luckily, I did not.
Good for you. But any stories you've heard?
I do have quite a few friends who are Chinese and foreign citizens living in China who obviously had experience in dealing with emergency cases or going for the regular checkups. And I would say that the system, I'm just sort of relaying the experience of my friends who are foreign citizens. I think this would be the more colorful example, that the system is actually very efficient. Everything is bookable online. You don't have... Okay,
you mean like doctor's appointments?
Doctor's appointments and prescriptions can be all received by emails. But the probably experience that they've had is similar to what I experience with in my daily job when I deal with Chinese companies, is that there is definitely a lack of English-speaking doctors. Mm-hmm. So the language barrier is probably the biggest problem you would face. But otherwise, no, I would say, sensations that happen to them, nothing dramatic. But ultimately, when you go to the hospital, your desire is to get better.
Right.
So eventually they did, and all the prescriptions worked, which means that they got what they wanted, and they got understood, and the doctors did their job well.
Okay, speaking of language barrier, of course, I know there is no Google in China, so I cannot use Google Translate, but I'm sure there are local translation online services where even if I were there and could not speak a word of Mandarin, I should be able to speak in English to one of those machines and they'll tell the doctor what I need.
Technically, yes, but the machines make a lot of funny technical mistakes.
I'm sure they do.
So that's why I tried some of them maybe 3 or 4 years ago when I had to explain something to a taxi driver. And we ended up sort of talking live anyway, because the more we use the live translating app, the more we were going nowhere. So highly recommend maybe use just the Baidu Translate, which is an equivalent of Google Translate, where you have to type messages and just show them maybe on the screen. Rather than just use the voice recording ones.
I experienced that reverse a couple of years ago in Singapore. I was walking down the road and a Chinese family approached me and they held a tiny device. It was not a phone. It was basically a dedicated translation device. And they started speaking to me in Mandarin and it was asking me, where is the hotel? So I've seen it working the other round. Slava, we talk a lot about aging in China. That the country has a very adverse demographic dynamic. Cities tend to mask that because lots of young people are coming to the cities to work, and the cities always feel vibrant. Even if you go to Tokyo, one of the most dramatically aging society in the world, it feels very youthful. But when you go outside, you see towns and villages that are empty. Did you experience similar things in China?
I have to say I did not experience any ghost towns. If we're talking about that part of the so-called Chinese reality, of course, I did see like very large development sites where you have maybe 10 or 20 buildings being constructed at the same time with no lights in the windows. But I just take it as a sign of maybe they haven't been open for sale yet. But two things I wanted to say. When you travel, the deeper you go into the country, the more of the elderly population you see on the streets. But I wouldn't say that it's something negative, because my impression is that population in China is extremely active. All of this seemingly retired people, they're actually engaged in jobs. They have their own shops. You actually seen them doing something. And that's why I think it makes China one of the fascinating places where people remain active business-wise well into their sort of older age. And that's what I think it's probably not as seemingly dramatic in terms of the demographic changes and impact on economy as we might think.
Interesting. And culturally, is there ageism in Chinese culture? Are old people considered increasingly useless, or there is significant amount of respect given to the elders, the grandparents, and the retired folk?
I think when it comes to business and employment, I did not hear, even using the examples of my friends who work in China, that this is the case. I think it's, of course, it's a common trend that let's say the bigger the company is, the more international it is, or the more strategically important it is to the government, so to say, the less of the elderly population you have in client-facing roles or foreign investors-facing roles. But when you go deeper in the country and the smaller the businesses, quite a lot.
Right.
So
interesting. Slava, so you are originally from Russia. Is there any similarity between Russia and China?
Culturally, I feel like we're brothers and sisters.
Really?
I personally, the more I was learning, or the more I learned Chinese language and learned about the culture, I see a lot of similarities in how we feel about certain things, how we express our opinion about certain things, what emotions and feelings are depicted in poetry and songs, even in the daily language. It's very, very similar. And this is what I think makes it even more enjoyable to learn the language. One of the parts, for example, is that China uses a lot of examples to describe certain characters or certain points of humans' character to teach young children and generally to give you lessons about...
Like cautionary tales.
Exactly. They use a lot of nature-related examples, plants, animals. I would say probably in the beauty, like sort of points of natural beauty, meaning sunrise or sunset or the blizzard in winter, the blossoming flowers in spring, and all the way to the actual single examples of certain plants or trees, which then explain to you different types of characters of people and teach you to become better in life, to sort of strive to improve yourself and develop certain characters to sustain different challenges in life. And the one that I think I think Chinese people generally have great sense of humor. So in all of these examples, they definitely have a bit of humor as well. And I'll just give you two examples. One is probably more on the sentimental side, where seasons. So, for example, seasons. Every season in China is associated with a certain plant, which is present in a lot of poetry and paintings and art. So, winter is, for example, is associated with a plum blossom. And there is a very deep lesson in that because you think, okay, what's so special in the plum? But in China, especially in the middle part of it, plum trees blossom in January. And in January, it's pretty cold. Sometimes it's even snowing. So you can imagine the picture. The earth covered with snow, you have hills, endless, all the way to the horizon, but all covered with beautiful plum flowers. Pink or white or sort of red. And it basically teaches you the lesson which says that even when you think that the conditions are so harsh around you, there is always a place for beauty that will always find its way in life if you keep believing in it. So this is more of the sentimental one, but the one most defining one is the example of chrysanthemum, which is representing autumn. And chrysanthemum is the flower which blossoms the last. All the other flowers have already blossomed out, and the season actually comes to an end because the next one is winter coming. Chrysanthemum blossoms sort of September onwards. And it basically depicts patience. That one of the tools which you can use to get rid of all the competition is just to be patient. Everyone else already died out, and here you come. Here is your rockstar moment. There is obviously no competition around, and you will be seen beautiful, just probably there is no one else.
Fascinating.
Yes.
And you see parallels to these sort of tales to in Russian?
It's definitely using the examples of natural events, the places of outstanding beauty, the plants and the animals, to describe different emotions that we experience. Even the instruments, the folk instruments that are present in Russia and China, although they're very different in structure, but the sounds that they make are very similar. So that's why I think you cannot not relate to this. And I discovered being in China that Chinese are great fans of Russian culture as well. They're big fans of Russian songs and Russian music, especially the classic one, which most of which were written at the beginning or the middle of past century. And we had a great time with my Chinese teacher there, singing Russian songs. I was singing in Russian, she was singing in Chinese, but the same tune, which was fascinating. Yeah, it bonds you really quickly, and you really connect to people. It's not even a matter of breaking the ice, but it's actually really about bonding, which means a lot. Yes.
Brilliant. Slava, we have come fairly close to the end of our podcast. One parting thought about lingering impression of your travels through China and what makes your sort of tugs your heart about China that is not necessarily part of popular perception.
If I had to choose one thing that I would say is underappreciated and underrated by the rest of the world, is that how not only well educated but considerate and globally aware Chinese people are. It starts from them, for example, during the school years, reading as a routine, as part of this daily school program, best classics almost of all main countries of the world, sort of economically speaking. So my teacher, I just discovered by sort of accident that by the time she was in the 7th grade, she already read all the classics that I read in school in Russia, main classics that children read in French schools, in schools in London, in Chinese language. And I, during my years, do not recall a single piece of poetry or piece of literature written by Chinese author that we would be reading in Russia, for example. And going all the way through being deeply aware of all the main aspects of life that matters to the outside world. We have an impression that because China doesn't have Google, they ban Yahoo, they sort of
the Great Firewall of China.
Create the Great Wall of China, exactly. They also create information barriers, which is completely not true. It doesn't make them any more impaired in that sense, in their ability to reach out to the rest of the world, to actually have a keen desire to understand what is going on, not just from the point of view of getting the information, but actually relating to people outside and trying to make their life experience as rich and outgoing as possible.
Fascinating. I think, coronavirus notwithstanding, I have this deep desire to go travel through China after talking to you, Slava. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. I hope you enjoyed your sugar-free Kopi C, and I hope that, our listeners were touched by your experiences in China as much as I was. Thank you very much, and this was Kopi C with Taimur Baig.
Thank you, Taimur, and thank you to the listeners, and 再见.